Hello and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, an incredible guest from the author, I should say, of the brand new book, well, not brand new, but new book, definitely still new, I'm Not Holding Your Coat. Nancy Barile is here, and this is an incredible conversation with someone with an unbelievable perspective on the genesis and the birth of American hardcore on the East Coast. And we will talk about all this in a second and more. But first, if you want to get in touch with me, head over to the email address turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham. Tristan, thank you for all the hard work you do, and he will get the message to me. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Left4Damian. If you want to support the show, the best way to support the show is just by telling all your friends about it, letting everyone know that you enjoy this podcast that we do here on several times a week now, generally several times a week. You can also support the podcast by subscribing to it and rating it on your platform of choice, or by heading over to patreon.com/turnedoutapunk. And thank you to everyone that does do that over there. It really does help keep this show going. And you can check out some of the fun stuff we do over on that thing. And speaking of support, this show would not be possible without the kind, loving support of the fine folks at Vans who came aboard a few years ago and said, Damian, do what you do. Just don't do it out of your own pocket and help me cover the costs of doing this thing. And for that, I am eternally grateful to them. Thank you very much for that. Also, I play in a band. We're called Fucked Up. We will be going on tour with a band called Faith No More. You may have heard of them. In the month of September. You can check online for the dates for those shows. I'm very excited to be playing those shows. They're outdoors and stuff and should be very fun. And then hopefully we'll be going on tour in January to play some songs off of, the whole album of David Comes to Life, which will be reissued by Matador Records. Also, we have Year of the Horse, a 90-minute long song that I didn't write it, I sing it, but I'm very proud to be involved in it because it is an incredible song. And I didn't write it, so I can say that. I really do mean that. I think it's the best thing we've ever done. And you can find that on Tank Crimes Records right now and order that. I think it's going to be dropping December 3rd. So weird now with this vinyl, these vinyl delays and vinyl shortages and all that kind of crap. But yeah, so hopefully we'll see you when we come to your town. And thank you for supporting that band as well. All right, on to today's show. Today on the show, Nancy Barile is here. And Nancy is the author of the brand new memoir called I'm Not Holding Your Coat, My Bruises and All Memoir of Punk Rock Rebellion. And this book is on bazillion points. It is a fantastic read. I strongly recommend it for anyone of all ages. It's a fantastic book, and it's written in a way that it can be enjoyed by even some younger people as well. And for older folks like myself, this thing is an essential read. I don't want to get too into it. You got to read this book, and we get into some of the stories now on the show. Nancy has an incredible perspective, and she is super cool. If you want to find her on social media, you can find her at Nancy Barile on Instagram. And I strongly recommend following her. She's a really cool person, and I was very stoked to get the chance to talk to her. So I don't have to ramble on anymore, really, just other than to say, get this book. It's fantastic, and that is it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Nancy Barile on Turned Out a Punk. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
And thanks for having me.
Well, as I was just telling you off air, I am a massive fan of your book, and I think it's a book I'm trying desperately. My eldest son will not take any music advice or any, cultural advice from me at this point, but I'm desperately trying to get him to read your book because I think it's such an important book, not even because of the music you're covering for young people to read, but I just think because of empowerment and about how it's just about, the great thing about punk rock is how it gave young people voice and a chance for young people to kind of take control.
Absolutely. 100%. It's the whole reason I got into it,
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I got to start this off though the way they all start off, which is Nancy. How did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across it?
Yeah, so my dad was a Marine. I went to Catholic school. So I faced, what I felt was a lot of oppression at the time, and music was always an escape. And so I read, I used to get Circus magazine and Cream and Hit Parader. And I had some older friends who turned me on to music. I kind of started out liking like David Bowie and Roxy Music and Alice Cooper, T-Rex, bands like that. And then gradually, punk rock sort of kind of emerged, with bands like Patti Smith and the Ramones and Iggy Pop. And I saw Iggy probably it was 1977 with Blondie opening. And then after that, I was all in,
Yeah.
100%.
I love that era, like where it's kind of like before punk really kind of kicks off, but it's like there's this sort of wave of kids that were waiting for punk rock. People have described it as almost waiting for it because
Agree.
the stuff you're looking for, like that's the direct precursors to what would come next, right?
Exactly. Those were like my gateway drugs, Alice Cooper, bands
Mm-hmm.
like that. Even Kiss to a certain extent,
Yeah.
when they first came out, those were all the bands that sort of, I always liked the kind of more dangerous side of music. And that was my thing. And live performances. I loved going to shows. Like I went to shows constantly from the time I was allowed to go to shows at probably age 15. And I just saw anybody who came into town and, was kind of forming my own opinions as I, saw them.
Yeah, you've got an incredible list in the book of the first shows that you went to, and I was going through that and kind of being like, "Oh, who was that band? Who was that band?" Like, I think you saw the Reds early on as well, like the Philadelphia band.
I might have. Yeah, I might have. I don't remember them as distinctly as some of the other bands that I saw, but I think they might have opened for someone that I saw.
Well, who were some of the early local bands? I mean, even pre kind of codification of it, like pre punk rock, like Bloodless Pharaohs. I'm trying to think of some early Philadelphia bands because there is like a scene there, obviously.
There was
Right.
a guy named Ken Queter who sort of had like a punk sensibility about him
Mhm.
that I used to see. There was a band called the Warm Jets. There were the Autistics. I used to go see Karen Bahari, who was kind of like almost like a cabaret singer, but like funky, and
Yeah.
had, kind of had some stuff. So there was a club in town called the Hot Club, and they booked, bands from all over the world, but also a lot of local bands. And
Mhm.
so, I was fascinated with the fact that I could see a band on stage and then like, they'd be outside smoking cigarettes and I could go over and talk to them if I wanted to,
Yeah.
it was really cool.
Yeah, like even in the early sort of punk stuff, you have that sort of like breaking down of that division between, fan and artist. You hear about the Ramones coming in, just chilling with kids before and after the show, and just that's like unheard of in music, still kind of unheard of in music.
Yeah, and I loved it. I loved that because I was fascinated by musicians and the process and just everything about it. And so being able to like connect with the musician was really, and just talk to them. And it was,
Mhm.
it was really cool. I loved
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing about punk that makes it so awesome is that it starts messing with what the archetype of a rock star is, and starts turning it on its head. And part of that subversion is doing away with that pedestal, and just and it really is that's almost like the lasting effect of it. I think that's one of the more important things that kind of hold over from that period.
I agree 100%.
So who are some of the early shows that you went to? Like some were like when you're first kind of getting into the punk. Actually, before even punk rock, some of your favorite shows that stuck out to you.
I mean, I saw David Bowie was like, probably number one on my list at the time. I was a huge, huge Bowie fan. I loved Roxy Music. I saw them a bunch. I saw Sparks, Patti Smith, Alice Cooper. My first concert was Rod Stewart and Faces. I think it might have even been their last tour together. Just, completely blown away by it. I saw Bruce Springsteen, wasn't hugely a Springsteen fan, but appreciated the show that he gave his
Mhm.
his fans. I saw Blue Oyster Cult. I saw Bay City Rollers. One of the greatest shows I saw around that time were the Tubes. The Tubes were, I mean, their stage show was insane, just absolutely insane. And I can just, remember being completely blown away by that. I was lucky, man. I saw just about everybody that came through. I remember the only band I didn't see that I wanted to see was probably Led Zeppelin. And I had tickets, it was right after graduation. I had tickets to see them. And Robert Plant's son died, and they canceled it. They canceled that tour, and I didn't see him. But I mean, I saw Aerosmith, I saw Jefferson Airplane, I saw Paul McCartney and Wings. Like, I would go to anything, just because it was live music, and then kind of decide whether I liked it or not. And I didn't always like it. It was, some bands that I saw, did not appeal to me, but then there were a lot, that I did. Cheap Trick, was a band that I absolutely loved back in the day. Queen, oh my God, I mean, they could never recreate what they did on the album, but man, there was nothing like them, watching Freddie at his peak, it was just incredible. So, and I love seeing women on stage. At that Rod Stewart show, Susie Quattro opened,
Oh, that's awesome.
And for a 15-year-old kid, like girl watching that, that was mind blowing to me. And that was the same with Patti Smith and Blondie and years later, Joan Jett. I love seeing women on stage. That was, just something that felt really empowering to me, even though I didn't have an ounce of musical talent.
There's a band, is it called Helen Keller? Helen Killer, that was like a female fronted like punk band from Philadelphia early on.
I don't know that band. No, I've never heard that band.
These are all bands I've just found random singles of, but it's like really fascinating because like there isn't as, like recorded wise as much of sort of like a defined early first wave punk scene in Philadelphia. So much as so as like a few years later when it's the scene that you're really heavily involved in, where there is like a lot of bands. Like it just feels like, I don't know, apart from the Hoosiers or the Hooters, and bands like that, like it doesn't feel like there was as much of sort of that first wave early punk scene.
There was like, there were bands like the Sick Kids who had a guitarist, a female guitarist, and there were bands, but it always seemed to me Philly never got its due. And I think a lot of the reason for that was because the bands didn't have money to make records, and they didn't have money to tour, and so it was insular, and we would see the bands, but maybe other people didn't as much, like making a record and stuff. When we decided, the band that I managed to do it, on our own, it was expensive, and most of us, we didn't have any money,
Yeah.
So, and I sometimes I look at Al and my husband that's in SSD Control, and he had a dad who was like, oh, you want to make a record, I'll lend you the money, like that didn't happen in Philadelphia. Nobody's dad was lending them any money to make a hardcore record.
It's fascinating though how much economics plays a role in that early hardcore scene. Like I think Jerry A, when he was on, brought up the fact that like in DC, a lot of those kids had money that they were able to come from. So that's a reason that a lot of that stuff was so well documented compared to some of the other scenes. And like in the case of Poison Idea, he talked about how they had to, find other less legal economic means of achieving capital to put out their records.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw that when I moved to Boston, Al's, he's, his father, blue collar background and stuff, but there were a lot of kids that came from very wealthy backgrounds and stuff, and who had the means, to make records and stuff. And in Philly, it just seemed, the bands that, that I came up with, Sadistic Exploits, Why Die, Autistic Behavior, Informed Sources, Decontrol from Philly, we didn't have a lot of money, I sold my high school ring to help make the first Sadistic Exploits record.
Yeah. No, and that's what it is. It really does feel like, and there isn't like a label, like there's not like a Discord or like a Danger House, like, your Sadistic Exploits Why Die, like you're self-releasing, these bands are self-releasing their records themselves. You know, there's not really a label that's like, okay, touch and go style, we'll put
Right.
out all your records and we'll handle the distribution and you know, so yeah, like it doesn't really get its due in the same way some of these other scenes do.
Right. I agree 100% with that, and there were a lot of good bands in Philly, definitely.
Yeah, when did you see the changeover begin to happen to like kind of that younger scene that you're mentioning, like Decontrol,
Yeah,
Sadistic Exploits?
that's like 1981 was when it really kind of exploded when we did the very first punk fest, and we wanted all local bands on it. So if you were a punk band, we wanted you on it. Excuse me. And we had 5 bands, $5, and it was all local bands. And Philly had some they had a lot of eclectic bands that weren't necessarily, they weren't hardcore bands or even punk. Like there was a band called the Stickmen who were kind of like experimental. And they had this woman who was a visionary, Beth Ann Lehman, who was just incredible. The things when I look back now as a performance artist, and she played all these different instruments and stuff, and she was amazing. And there was a band called Head Cheese who was almost all female. I think the drummer was male. And, they had like a little hit on WXPN, University of Penn's radio station and stuff. So, it was like very fertile for creativity, but I don't know how much it spread out into other areas,
Mm-hmm.
But there was always something going on. And there was always a band to see after I moved into, downtown Philly, like every night you could go probably see a band if you wanted. So it was fun.
Was there like a lot of overlap between like, like the more hardcore kind of stuff and that more arty stuff? Like bands like Ruin, I guess, would have existed in both worlds, but like,
Yeah,
would,
exactly.
would like Head Cheese have played with like Why Die or was that kind of like separate
I
little
can't remember
scenes?
that they ever did. I would think they were maybe like all those bands would play like Omni or the East
Mm,
Side Club. But as far as like the shows that I was doing, the Punk Fest, we basically had either punk or hardcore bands playing,
yeah.
or
Yeah.
what we considered punk. There was a big kind of art scene, and
Hmm.
and that was confusing to me. Like I was jealous of it because, the Head Cheese, they'd be up there like, banging on metal pots and pans and stuff, and making noise. I wasn't a fan of the music, but I was jealous of the fact that the women had enough guts to be on stage doing it. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how, these scenes kind of happen seemingly on top of each other a lot of times. Like you look at New York and that no wave stuff's happening kind of simultaneously as the hardcore scene's happening. But there is that kind of divide between the stuff that's like really truly, I guess, gritty from the streets punk and the stuff that's more university arty stuff that's also kind of happening at the same time. Like it seems to happen over and over again in every city.
Yeah, I mean, we had Pure Hell, and
Yeah.
they were, to me, one of the quintessential punk band, kind of the ones that launched it,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they were Philadelphia, and they at least, were able to get records out and tour, and they went to England and everything, and Kenny lived in my building, and I was just like, wow, I can't believe this guy is on the elevator with me.
They are a band that does not get their due. Like you're saying, they are they're with Sid Vicious. They're backing up Sid Vicious when he's in New York. Like they are like that band. And yeah, like they did get those records out. They got to England, but like it doesn't seem like they get canonized in the way they should for
No,
how
they should
important.
be. They absolutely should be. They were an amazing, amazing, pioneering, groundbreaking band.
Hmm. Did they were they still around by the time like Sadistic Exploits and all they or they're already gone by that point, right?
No, they had gone to England and come back, and I don't think at that point they were a viable band. Like I don't think they were playing together at that time. I know they might. I think they reformed later, but
Hmm.
at that time, like they weren't playing anywhere. Like I never saw them live, much to my dismay. So
Well, I
yeah,
think they were doing something a couple years ago with
yeah,
Jackal for singing for him too,
yep,
which is
yeah.
like he's to me he's one of the greatest front people ever. Like his voice is just so over the
I
top.
love it. I love it that you say that because that dude is one of the coolest human beings
Yes.
on earth. And when he came when he came onto the scene, I was like, who is this guy? Like I was like a little scared of him. He's, first one in the pit, first one off the stage, so much energy, just exuding coolness, and still is to this day. Like, we have punk rock reunions in Philadelphia from time to time. And, I got to see him recently and reconnect. And oh my God, I love that dude. God, I love that dude. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. He was on the Live in Philadelphia episode that I did, and I don't know, it just made it because like that's a legend. And like you're saying, like not to keep reiterating it, but like these Philadelphia bands don't get, like SSD and Boston, like that's canonized, and Minor Threat and DC, that stuff's canonized, but like this Philadelphia stuff, like a lot of it's still pretty obscure. I guess the Wide Eye stuff's been reissued, but Sadistic Exploits, like it's just that, thank goodness you sold that ring, or there'd be no documentation of that thing still.
Yeah. I mean, people didn't have money. We couldn't make records, couldn't really tour. I mean, the furthest when I was involved with Sadistic Exploits that we went was New York. We used to go up to New York a lot and play, and I don't think, we played anywhere else. There were no one had a van. I don't even know how we used to get I don't know how we got our equipment to New York. I don't know if we borrowed equipment. I don't remember, but I can tell you no one had a nice van, to do it. No.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's even, like even if a band doesn't have as much money, like the whole procedure is so outlined at this point. Like, what do you do if you're a band going out of town? Like, like these things were being figured out around 81 or 82. Like it's this stuff really being established as like a way of doing things.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, of course, now it's so easy with computers and stuff. Like, I was just reading this article in the New Yorker about something called hyperpop, and like this 15-year-old kid in North Carolina like has this huge hit on in hyperpop. I'm like, what is it? Yeah. I was looking it up.
Well, I think it's fascinating now, like on the show, talking to people it's decentralized. Like, you're not geographically limited in where your scene's going to be. You're limited to whoever you can find on the internet. So you don't have like the Philadelphia scene or the Toronto scene where I'm from. Like, you now have I'm part of this scene, and it's global.
Right. And genre is almost out the window as well.
Yeah.
The punk, is it, what is it? I don't know.
Yeah. Like, it's amazing when you think about like how established these divisions were at one point between these genres. Like you're saying, the art punk and the hardcore punk, like in the grand scheme of things, they're very close together in what they're both trying to do. But like these divisions were so established at one point, and it doesn't seem to be the same way now with these kids.
Yeah, I got a call from an interviewer from USA Today, and they're like, we want to interview you about pop punk. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure, And then I'm like, what the hell is pop punk, I'm like on the computer, like looking it up, And, there's all these, these bands, this whole Travis Barker influence, and, all these people that are putting out pop punk that aren't really punk, but they're churning it out. So, yeah, genre's out the door, and everyone's having fun. So that's good. That's good with me.
Yeah. And I think with punk, though, it is weird how you can somehow connect it all back, right? Like, it all does weirdly connect back. Like, even pop punk, like without the Dead Milkmen, I don't think it'd be the same sort of thing. It wouldn't, I don't know if that sense of humor would have been there, even though it's so far removed from what they were doing at this point. Like, I just think like it's all in there at some level.
Right. I love that. I love that about music in general, that everybody, takes, and it becomes mutates, and, becomes this new cool thing. And it's fun.
What were your takes on some of the other scenes that you were seeing around that time? Like going to like DC and New York, because it was so regional and it is so influenced by like what the people in these places were like.
Yeah. So when I was going to New York didn't really have a hardcore scene. The only hardcore band that was playing at the time was probably the Mob, and of course the Bad Brains, had moved to New York, and Crucial Truth, and so, but there were a lot of really good kind of what I considered punk bands like Kraut, who I loved, and Heart Attack, and Urban Waste, and bands like that, which I kind of saw maybe as a little more Reagan Youth, a little more punk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, those scenes, I could just, I can remember going to New York the first time when the Exploits played and, being scared, are they going to like us? Are they, what are they going to be like? And, the first, three people I meet are, Jimmy G and John Watson, who was the first singer of Agnostic Front, and Chris Cherokee, who sang for Cause for Alarm. And they just embraced us, man. They became like my brothers. Like, I love those guys to this day. Chris has passed on, but like, I still keep in touch with them all, and the women on the scene were great. And it was just, then New York became kind of like our second home. And we were up there all the time. It's an hour and a half on the train where we're driving, so if something wasn't happening in Philly, we went to New York. And so the New York scene was really vibrant and, fun to play and stuff. We always had a good time there. And then DC, I didn't get to go to until after I met Al, but you read the story in my book about when SOA came and played with Black Flag and there was like a huge riot and I got hit in the head by a DC skin. So I was like, I hate DC,
Yeah.
and I never want to go there because they're a bunch of Neanderthals. And like, I loved Minor Threat and I loved SOA, but like, I didn't want to go there because I didn't think their scene was, the way ours was. And so, well, not that that particular show is a good indication of welcoming, but I didn't, and it wasn't until I met Al in 82. And then we went down to, I think it was in Baltimore, Minor Threat played, and I met Ian and stuff. And then, I got to see more of the DC scene and, it was of course great, but I didn't know that. And the same with Boston. The weird thing about Boston that freaked me out when I moved here was that shows were at 5 o'clock, all the shows in Philly were at night,
Yeah.
and then, there it was like 5 p.m. And I was like, this is weird, like
Yeah.
it was an adjustment for me, because I was used to things being nocturnal and they weren't in Boston at all. It was like broad daylight, and but their scene was big and all the bands were good. Like all the Boston bands were good. Like no matter which band you saw, whether it was Gangrene or Jerry's Kids or FUs or whoever you saw, DYS, they were good. And so it was really fun. And then of course, all the good bands came through as well. So they had a great scene.
I've kind of heard it said that like Boston and DC were doing something different than what I guess New York and Philadelphia were doing, where like those were like hardcore scenes, whereas what was happening in New York was more of a punk scene. And it was really militarized by the arrival of DC people and Boston people coming to shows. And New York people still deny this, but like beating people up in New York, which is something that also comes up on the show time and time again. Like,
yeah, that is so mythologized, I mean, I know when Al and I don't want to speak for Al, but I know when when he and Boston went down to like A7 to see the Bad Brains, it was still very much a leather jacket, makeup-y kind of punk scene. And they immediately embraced the physicality that the Bad Brains brought to a show, and they just kind of went wild, That being said, there were not a lot of New York hard kids probably there that day, like it didn't, that, this whole like Boston, it just, to me, it was way overblown. If you talk to Vinny Stigma and Roger, Vinny counts Al as his favorite guitarist, and Roger says the Kids Will Have Their Say first record is one of his favorites, like, I think it was super, super overblown, every time SSD Controlled played New York, they were so well received and it was insane, like the shows were great. Towards the, maybe like 84, when I remember one time they played Rock Hotel and, some Boston kids were drunk and something had happened at CBGB's with like a joke Boston band early in the day that spilled over to Rock Hotel. And there was definitely some tension in the air that night. And I think like I remember Jonathan Anastas from DYS saying like I got punched in the face, and I was like I didn't know about that until like 5 years ago, like I'm like, if no one threw a bomb at you and no one was arrested and no one got, 45 stitches in their head, like it doesn't count to me, like,
Mm-hmm.
so you got punched in the face, like, okay, like that's not a big deal to me, like I've been in, really dangerous situations. And so a little scuffle at a show, oh, that's
Yeah.
okay. But that's why we did the Buff Hall show when I still lived in Philly, because there, we sensed Allison and the other people that were involved with the BYO, we sensed that maybe there's starting to be some inner city schisms, So we said, we're going to have this hardcore love fest and we're going to bring Minor Threat from DC, SSD Control from Boston, Agnostic Front from New York, and then a Flag of Democracy and Crib Death from Philadelphia, and we're going to play in Camden, New Jersey.
Yeah.
I don't know, like we were kids, we had lost perspective, I don't know. So.
But what a legendary bill. Like, it's amazing to kind of think like these were just your friends at the time. You're just putting this on for local scenes, but this thing is so storied. Like, that show is like one of those shows that people around the world know about.
Yeah, and I'm really so proud to have been associated with it. And despite the craziness of Ian getting hit by a car and Al's van getting smashed and having to turn to the ghetto riders to be security for the night, like despite all that, every band brought their A game. And I don't know if it was the fear, the tension, everything, it just spilled over on stage. And I'm really psyched that there's at least video of SSD Control set and Minor Threat set, because no one would believe it unless you saw it,
Yeah.
Like those videos, I still watch them to this day. And I'm like, damn, that was fun. Those bands were great. And the energy in the room was intense.
Yeah.
I love it.
Like, those are like the three bands kind of that not carry their scene, because like obviously all these scenes, but like, like those are three bands that were definitely like typical for their scene. Would you say FOD kind of occupies almost the same space for Philadelphia? Like, who would be the band for Philadelphia that would be like the Agnostic Front or the Minor Threat or
today, like looking back?
Looking back, yeah. Like, who would you say?
Looking back, maybe Why Die, maybe Ruin.
Yeah.
Those bands are pretty storied. FOD, that was their first show, when they played Hall. Not a bad first show, right?
No, pretty good.
And Agnostic Front, it wasn't their first show, but maybe it was like their third or fourth, and John Watson was still singing for them.
Oh yeah, it's before Roger started singing.
Yeah, way before Roger.
Yeah, that's right.
Singing. Yeah. So it was very early on, and so I think. I think maybe even Rabies might have been drumming. I can't remember who, it was, it was very, very early on in their career, but they were our friends, so we wanted them on the bill because they were our buddies, and what a night, and that also the night my parents met Al for the first time, which is just crazy, oh my God.
So like a personally significant night and also a very significant night in the history of rock and roll as well. So.
I think so. Yeah, definitely. I just knew, the van was smashed and I just knew my dad would know what to do.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I don't know what we're going to do here, and he did, and he handled everything, he was good. My dad was really tough and he was really strict, but man, if you needed him, he had that Marine Corps, I'll take care of it, and he did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's funny, like how this is like music of teenagers, and you talk about this in this book, like how significant this scene was for giving young people a space and a place to have voice. But like, here we are all these years later, essentially still like obsessing over the music of teenagers. This podcast is about the music that was done by people 17 to 30.
I totally get that, and that's why when I wrote the book, I was like, why am I still talking about hardcore 40 years later? I've gone on, I left hardcore like 85, and I've had a career and, I've done all these things that like, why am I always going back? And that's why I talked to Ian, because I knew he was still in the scene, and, maybe not hardcore, but still in music. And I wanted him to help frame the book for me, and basically for me as a teacher, punk rock and hardcore has informed every part of my teaching practice. And I believe 100% it's the reason why I am successful as a teacher, and once, I won a couple of awards and people would say, like, oh, what makes you a good teacher? And, after I thought about it, really deeply, I was like, punk rock makes me a good teacher, because it helps me connect with my alienated and marginalized teens, because I was one, I'm very different from my students, and I grew up with a great deal of privilege, but I remember what it was like not feeling ownership in my school and not feeling empowered with what I was learning. And it also made me kind of fearless, and in my first years of teaching, there were a lot of gangs in my school and I did a lot of gang outreach. And I was never afraid, people are like, aren't you afraid? I'm like, no, because of everything that I experienced in Philadelphia, and so it really helped me. And it also, made me to this day question authority and to create assignments that help my students like think independently, and so it's the whole cornerstone of my practice. And so, yeah, punk rock was great.
Yeah, like it is a real, and that's the one thing that I think, kids need now more than ever is the fact that you can create your own world. Like this is the tools that you can kind of use, and you could still like all these things you can go in and put on your own show now. Like maybe not right now, but when things change, but you'll be able to put shows on again. You'll be able to like, you don't have to rely, especially in this world where we're so corporately involved on every level now. Like this is like the antidote to all that, and it still works.
I love it. And I love that. And I don't know if you know Dominic and Samantha, who do Bad Music Taste podcast. They were like the second podcast I did, and they're like 13. They're in freaking middle school.
Yeah.
And I love it. They're just, they decided during the pandemic to use their time wisely and start their own podcast. And so to me, that's really, really cool. Like when I hear my students, doing something out of the norm. I remember even like, one time a kid came in and she was like, I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. My friend and I went down to New York and we went to a show, and I was like, good for you, like, yeah, or I had a student one time who she was really good at taking tickets for big shows and turning her ticket into saying that she was in the pit, and she was like, oh, miss, you're going to think awful of me. And I was like, no.
You have no idea what I've seen.
No, I kind of think that's cool. Could you do that for me when I go to, so, I like to see my kids, stretching into their horizons and stuff. It's harder for them too, because they're on the electronic leash, I didn't have that, I could say, I'm here, Mom, and they would have no way of knowing. So,
well, it's funny, like talking to people now, like I'm a parent, I've got a 12-year-old as my oldest, and like talking to people on here and how many of them were going to shows at 12 years old. Like I was going to shows by the time I was 13, but my little brother was 11 and I was bringing him to shows. Like I couldn't imagine that happening now with my kids. Like, it's changed. We're so much stricter now, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to one of your podcasts with the Lunatics girl, and she was saying she was out at 12 years old, and I was like, I couldn't have done. I mean, I was out at 15, but I couldn't have done it at 12. But my parents had no idea what was going on, and even like years, maybe like 5-6 years ago, some people were making a documentary about Philly punk and hardcore, and they came to my dad's house and filmed me, and he was supposed to be mall walking. He was, he's like 85 at the time, and
yeah.
And he came home early and he was like, why are they interviewing you? And I was like, well, because, Dad, I did some shows and managed some bands. And he was like, well, I never knew anything like that was going on. And I was like, that's right. That's right, Dad. You didn't know anything about it. Sadly, neither of my parents lived to see the book, but it's dedicated to them.
Mhm.
I don't know whether they would be proud or horrified. So,
Well, there is like like a real power to subversion of what's going on, right? Like there is like it was, especially at that time, like so underground. Like we live in a post Green Day, post Nirvana world where like SSD shirts were on like Saturday Night Live, or like it's a different kind of world than where it was something completely underground and completely adversarial to people's way of life. Like post Charles Manson, punk is really the first real youth rebellion since the hippies.
yeah, I mean, it was completely counterculture. Again, that's one of the things I loved about it because, again, I'm coming up in the disco era, and to me, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of disco that I like. Um, but, I kind of didn't, that whole scene to me was just a little too much about things that I wasn't interested in, like, drugs and things like that, and so having punk rock as rebelling against conformity and things like that, I found it a great doorway into a new world. And it also introduced me, I grew up in a upper middle class suburb where maybe there was a handful of people of color at my school, and when I got involved with punk rock, I was meeting people from everywhere, and of people of color. And one of our good friends was a Vietnamese refugee, and that expanded my world and my horizons, and I really I loved it. It was great.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Philadelphia, like, it was a lot more diverse. Like, looking at the pictures of kids at the shows, looking at the makeup of bands, like, it wasn't as necessarily white, homogeneous, suburban as, like, a lot of other scenes, especially as hardcore would become as time would go on. Like, it really does feel like Philadelphia at that point did reflect a lot more of the diversity that the lyrics are kind of talking about in punk rock.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I loved that about Philadelphia. And that was, one of the reasons that I, again, wrote the book, because reflecting back, that was being introduced to a diverse and multicultural world at that age was really important to me, and I love that about Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a very diverse place. And it was cool to kind of come up that way and have my eyes opened in a way that I needed to have them opened.
Yeah. I think it's also punk just opens your eyes, not just in terms of, like issues of race, but like issues of class, like issues of sexuality. Like it just feels like, and I'm getting into it later, but like even getting into it when I got into it, it's still stuff that the world's catching up to now that we're discussing at shows or are being written about in fanzines or being sung about in lyrics or talked about on stage. Like it is, I don't want to say like an advanced thing, but it is advanced. Like we are talking about stuff that the world's not caught up to at a much younger age.
Yeah, I mean, I never learned anything about government, politics, I couldn't have told you the difference between a Democrat or Republican when I graduated from high school. I got my education about that through bands like The Clash, Crass, Dead Kennedys, and MDC.
Mm-hmm.
I was woefully ignorant, I had no idea. And that's where I learned, that was, and I can remember, researching the stuff to put in the sadistic exploits, the insert thing, and being in the library reading like Hannah Arendt and saying like, wow, I'm so stupid, I don't know, I'm so ignorant, and I made a vow right then that I would go back to school so that I could have these conversations with people, because I didn't know, and I felt bad that I didn't know.
But you were already hip to like Warhol and stuff, right?
Yeah, I loved Andy Warhol. I stalked that poor man all
I
over
love that part of your book. Oh
Philadelphia.
my gosh, I love that, the photos and stuff and the stories about that too.
Yeah,
But
he
like,
was always super nice to me, and very, very cool. But yeah, I did kind of, I was kind of a stalker to him because I thought he was great. I read his books, and we used to read Interview magazine, and I thought him and Fran Lebowitz, like if I could have run off and been at the factory, I would have, but I
yeah.
didn't have quite enough guts to do that.
And that's also just like that is the precursor to punk rock right there too, in its way. You always hear that. Well, you don't always hear, but I've heard a couple times that people have interesting stories and good stories about interacting with Warhol, but you don't really hear that about Lou Reed. You don't hear about.
No, I mean, I loved Lou Reed, but I saw him a couple times, and if he was in a bad mood, you felt it when he was on stage.
Yeah, I think you
You
can still feel it in videos when you watch the videos of him too.
Yeah, you could tell that he was in a bad mood. And I know he was rude to one of my friends one time. I never had any interactions with him, but I did love his music. So
Yeah. It's interesting too because it is, he's obviously like a direct precursor, and much in the same way that Iggy Pop is.
mhm.
Yet both of them, and Bowie in the same way, it's so much about persona, and it's so much about that wall that you're putting up between you and the people that enjoy the art that you create. And like with artists like the Ramones, and even with Patti Smith, like there's a lot more of sort of like trying to chip that away when
Yeah.
punk rock comes in.
Bowie was really great about that in Philadelphia. Bowie loved Philadelphia and the Sigma kids, the ones that camped out in front of
Mhm.
Sigma Sound Studios when he was making that record, to the point where he went down and let them all in and hear the record. And my friend Patty Brett, you know, um, there's pictures of her with Bowie. She was like my idol. And, I tell the story in the book where you can hear her name and all the young dudes on the David Live record,
Yeah.
where her friend, hit her chair and then she smacked him and he yelled Pat in the middle of it. You can hear it loud. And I always thought before I really knew the story, I always thought it was Bowie speaking to her. I didn't realize it was somebody in the audience yelling at her, but like he did tear down that wall in Philadelphia, and he always loved Philadelphia, and he always loved the Sigma kids and was really good to him. But Lou, I don't know. Lou was a little different.
Yeah, no, I think it takes all kinds, right, of these types of
Right.
personality things. But it's also interesting how you have that same sort of cult of personality start happening in punk rock. Like you brought up the Dead Kennedys. It happens with Jello Biafra really early, and obviously it's happened with Ian MacKaye now, and like where, it's not necessarily these people making themselves into these characters, like people kind of put this on them, Al as well, obviously, like, these people become larger than life to people that don't necessarily know 'em.
Yeah, I mean, I get like, now that people know that I'm married to Al, like I'll get people, they go through me to try to like get to Al, and some of the things they say, I'm like, where did you come up with that? Like the stories about who Al is. And, I mean, Al's like a really nice guy, and
Mhm.
he's also a brilliant man. He was an engineer and tested jet engines. And, he sort of has this kind of, hockey jock persona that people don't see through
Mhm.
unless they talk to him and they get to meet him. And so I do think like social media broke down some of those walls when people follow you on Facebook and they get to know like who you are a little bit. But yeah, yes, he played hockey, but there's a little bit more to him than that.
Yeah. Well,
And so it's funny.
well, it's like you were saying with that, with Boston and New York, the talk of that beef between the two cities, and like it almost this stuff becomes so mythologized that it takes on a life of its own, where it can be completely removed from the actual reality now, where it's just like the story, because it's been passed down from a time before there was an internet for so long, just these oral history tales that have
Right.
increased in size as they've been told time and time again.
And I think there was some schisms later on with other Boston bands and New York bands, like, with I don't even want to get into naming names, but
you don't have to. I think we know.
Yeah, I think, that there was some real stuff that happened, but that was like long after we were, that we were out of the scene,
Mm-hmm.
And recently I posted Nick Martin, who's, his father's the artist Bryce Martin, and he used to make these hand painted pins that were really neat. And I had one that he did that said, "Kill anyone with a beer in hand," because that was before SSD Control played with Minor Threat and MDC at Irving Plaza. Choke and the Boston Crew jumped on stage and they did this like little kind of like chant thing, "Kill anyone with a beer in hand." And then they did Fall Out and they all jumped into the crowd, and it was funny, like totally lighthearted, funny. So I posted the pin and people just kind of went crazy, they're like, "Wow, people died because of this." And, and like all this craziness. And then somebody had it taken down because it violated community on Instagram, I was so pissed.
Yeah.
Put it in my stories and they didn't get it there, but I was like, come on, like this was a joke. And I said that I was like, I will give you $1,000 for every person you ever find that ever had like a beer knocked out of their hand or had anybody say anything to them because they were drinking, because it just didn't happen. It just did not happen. I was there,
Mm-hmm.
but I do have a lot of guys, men, born in 1985, 1990, telling me what happened at those shows, because as a woman, I couldn't possibly know a woman who was there,
Well, and once again, I'm not trying to refute, and I'm definitely not trying to be one of those dudes with this at all. But I've definitely heard from some of the younger people how intimidating that Boston stuff was. And like, maybe they didn't see the humor because they were younger, but like Phelps and Choke and like how these guys were, to the wave of kids that were maybe like the next generation below, these guys were terrifying when they hit the pit because it was organized.
That's the truth. They, Boston always had a super physical scene, not a violent scene, a physical scene. And I think there's a difference, and so if you were going to go into the pit, like you had to be, prepared, and I mean, I think New York had a pretty physical scene after a while too. And Philadelphia definitely did, but, there is like a sort of hockey mentality, and I remember when I first, moved here, I think it was a Misfits show or something that I went to, and I was like, wow, that's pretty intense. I don't know that I would jump in there right now, and so, but it wasn't mean spirited in any way. And it wasn't, extremely violent. And I tell people that back then, the real threats to the scene were not in the scene. They were cops and they were locals. And that's who caused all the violence and horror at our shows, were cops and locals. And, it was scary, to have riots and have bombs thrown at you and stuff, like that to me was, it wasn't in the scene where I was worried. And so I heard about that years later when people were like, "Oh, well, straight edge people used to beat us up,"
Yeah.
I don't know anything about that.
It's amazing how parallel that is almost to what happens in California, where people always talk about the Los Angeles scene, and then when all the beach kids came in, and just how much more it got violent over time. But it's like you're saying, it's also these external forces like police and outside violence that's making kids more militant. Like if you're a group of kids and you're getting fucked with by just other peers for being in a punk, eventually you're going to, toughen up and have to, gang up just to be able to stand up for yourself.
Yeah. And that is absolutely the truth. And I always felt like, when and Ian and I talked about that, and he said, it's like when your parents tell you they used to walk 10 miles through the snow to get to school. The message wasn't the snow or the walk. It was that, school was important. And for us, it wasn't the bombs or the cops or the locals. It wasn't those crazy stories. It was the fact that the music was that important to us that we, quite frankly, risked our lives to see it, like we did. And it was almost always worth it.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a lot more of a struggle in a pre-alternative nation to be involved in this stuff. Like it took effort.
Yeah, it did. It definitely did. You never knew what was gonna happen. When I started writing the book and telling those stories, 40 years later, it was kind of like, oh my God, like this doesn't even, like, if I was reading this, I would be like, this couldn't have happened. All this crazy stuff couldn't have happened in one weekend, like when you look at that Dead Kennedys weekend, and it's Staten Island, we go to see the Dead Kennedys, SSD, DOA, and there's a riot, and then the next night we go to see the Dead Kennedys and, Saturday night, and they throw a bomb at us. And then the next night I go to see the Dead Kennedys again. I do a stage dive and like completely get it, my head smashed in, and that was a weekend, and when I'm writing it, I'm like, people aren't even going to believe this, but back then, that was Tuesday night.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's amazing how, like, like how many weekends have gone by in the pandemic that we can never remember. But like, there are these weekends where you went and saw, like in this case, 3 historic shows, 3 landmark shows. It could be 3 any shows. And the fact that, like, this is a scene that's so vibrant that you're willing to go out every single night. And because it's so vibrant, you carry these memories for your whole life afterwards.
Right. They were hugely influential on the person that I became, 100%. And, I teach in a low income school. And so almost everything I do is do it yourself, like if I want extra books for my classroom, I have to get them. If I want to go on field trips, I have to figure out how to make that happen. If I want to have guest speakers, I've got to, fundraise for it. And I'm so lucky because who funds half my stuff? Punk rock friends, like I just put something up. I wanted, school supplies, back to school supplies, because, my kids aren't going to have them, and pens and pencils and stuff like that. I put it up on Facebook through Donors Choose, which is a platform that, get teachers things that they need. It was up for 8 minutes and completely funded, over $300, and it was a woman who I met through Women of the Pit, which is a Facebook group for women only, who are involved in punk and hardcore. And she funded the whole thing,
Yeah.
and then all these other punks are writing on there, well, geez, I missed it, like, how can I help? Like, that's, to me, is so freaking heartwarming. It's unbelievable, that people will go out of their way to help my classroom like that. So I took my kids twice to New York, all expense paid, taking a bus down, seeing a show, going on a boat trip and everything. And all completely funded by friends and former students and punk rock people.
Yeah, like it really does feel like, maybe it's because I spent my whole life in this scene and I haven't known anything else, but it does feel like one of the few places where you do retain that community. Like, I know I could go to just about any city in the world and check in with some punk people and have somewhere to stay, or
Right.
like have people to hang out with, or like, and that's just because I'm part of this community where we all like aggressive music.
And I love that. I'm trying to plan a little book tour, and, so what do? Like, I call my friends, and Joe Hardcore down in Philly, who I've never met, was like, call me, like, here's what we're going to do,
Yeah.
and it's amazing. He doesn't even know me. And he was like ready to help me, that's amazing to me.
Yeah. And it's a lineage, right? Like you can trace back, the people that in Philadelphia now doing shows to where Sadistic Exploits and you doing their record and managing them. Like, from what I've been told, that's like the first hardcore band in Philadelphia, and there's still like a direct lineage from people to what's happening today. Like, there's very few scenes that I can think of that have that, relationship throughout history.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Joe said. He said, Joe McKay said, well, maybe if there wasn't Nancy Exploit, there wouldn't be Joe McKay now, Joe Hardcore, and I'm like, oh, I think there would be, but I love it that you said it.
Well, but it's only a handful of you, like you go back to it and it's really like a few hundred people in all these American cities, major American cities, that are building this little tiny DIY scene, right? Like, And that's illustrated by the fact that you all know each other to this day, like it really is. And like, it sounds overly dramatic to say like, what if one of those people weren't there? But it's true. Like if one of those people weren't there, like it would throw off the numbers dramatically. Like things probably would be different.
I would not be married to Al.
Yeah.
If I did not buy that SSD control record, call Sean Stern in California, to start the BYO, have the band come down and play, it would, no, my life would be different.
Yeah, absolutely. It changes. It's amazing to kind of like, it's almost like a fun van activity to kind of like be like, what if this didn't happen? Like what if this had happened differently? Like what if Philadelphia had a Discord? Yeah. And like like Circle of Shit and all these bands that remained unrecorded had been recorded. Like, would that have changed things?
Right. The whole butterfly effect,
Yeah, exactly. Nancy, this has been incredible. And anytime you want to come back on this show and talk about this stuff.
I can't even believe I'm on here. I mean, I've seen the people you've had on your show. And I'm like, I am not worthy. Like, how the hell did, that's been the great surprise of the book, is that I thought, I was going to write this book and some friends and relatives and diehard punk rockers would read it. And then it kind of blew up. And what a ride and what a fun ride it's been. And I get to do stuff like this. So it's really fun.
Well, before I let you go, one thing I really wanted to ask you about in regards to the book is like I noticed when I was reading it on the back cover, it says, I believe, young adult nonfiction, I believe, or something like that. Like it's very specifically mentions the fact that it's for a younger-ish audience. It's for everyone, obviously. Like I love the shit out of it, and I'm not a young person by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, like, was that a conscious thing that you were like, I want to write this to my students?
I didn't do that. The publisher did that. And I was, I saw it for the first time when the book came out, and I thought that was really cool. I was a little bit worried, like, what is my job going to think about this book? In fact, my nephew actually said to me, he was like, did you make it deliberately PG-13? And I said, well, I didn't really live an R-rated life. Like I lived a crazy life, but I wasn't like, Evan, Steinfeld from Biohazard, like I wasn't living that lifestyle, but, I was conscious of it when I was writing it, like, what will my students think? And I did have some students that, who really liked me, that bought the book. And I was kind of like terrified. What are they going to think? Because my kids don't really have punk rocks. They like different music. They don't really like punk rock, and I was, scared, but those that read it loved it. And, oh man, there's nothing more heartwarming than having one of your kids tell you that, your book empowered them or made them, I've had some kids, write to me about it, and my heart just swells, that they actually got something from it,
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And the fact that it resonates with an audience that has nothing to do with this music. As I say with my kid, I want him to read it because I think it's important for people that can't understand the brilliance of Why Die, as well as people that do understand it.
Right. Well, if you ever need me to talk to them, I'm really good with kids. They, even now, like, I do a lot of motivational speaking with teens and stuff. And after 5 minutes, they're like, yes,
Well,
it's great, and I don't look anything like my students, and I'm certainly, way older than them, but there is that, that punk rock thing that keeps me connected to them.
Well, part 2 will be you, me, and my eldest child.
Sounds good to me. Good luck.
Thank you, Nancy, for coming on the show. And I will take you up on that future conversation with me and my eldest child at some point. Or maybe some of the younger ones. We never know which one's going to be the wildest kid. But I look forward to having Nancy back for a part 2. Once again, I implore you, please grab this book. A fantastic read. I'm Not Holding Your Coat. And thank you for coming on the show, Nancy. All right, coming up later on this week on the show, I've been waiting to put this one up for a while and holding it back for some important announcements, and now is the time. Of a legend from the mighty DFL, who have a brand new EP, so pre-order that EP, Why Are You DFL, but also from the Turned Out a Punk favorites, the Atoms. And we finally get to the bottom of this legendary band, the Atoms. If you're a longtime listener, you have heard me bring up this band many, many times. And now finally, Monty Messick, the lead singer of the Adams, is here on the show with me. This is a fantastic conversation with an incredible human being. I'm excited for you to hear this one. And that'll be coming out later on this week. Pre-order that new DFL record on Skabam Records now. It's a new EP. It's amazing. I forgot to hear this thing, so check that out. Well, that's it for the show. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives of Indigenous peoples matter. We need to protect trans kids. We need to help trans people protect themselves. We need to stop hate and violence towards Asian people and people of different faiths, and just need to knock all this shit off, because this isn't political shit. This is just basic human rights stuff. People deserve the right to be free and live their lives. And just smash Nazis, fuck fascism, because that shit has got to go. That is a starting point. We'll go from there. Sign your organ donor cards, because you don't need those organs when they come looking for them, and it can help someone. I can speak from family experience that it can really, change lives. So sign those organ donor cards. Remember to try and do something creative. You make your own culture. You don't even have to put something out. Just do it for yourself and see how it goes. It'll help you feel better. Speaking of maybe helping you feel better, try meditating. I didn't believe in it, and then I have tried it now, and I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on this shit at all. But it is working for me. I'm just using one of those apps, and I find it has helped. And I didn't believe in it, so maybe try it for you. Maybe it'll work. Who knows? Get your shot. Stay safe, and hopefully I get to hang out and play a show with you soon, or hang out and be at a show with you soon. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.